Conservative leader Andrew Scheer accused the Liberals of dividing and distracting Canadians today while facing questions about his position on social issues. It was his first press conference since a 2005 video was unearthed by the Liberals last week in which he speaks vehemently against same-sex marriage. Scheer says a Tory government would not reopen debate on that issue or abortion. The CBC's Katie Simpson joins us now in studio with more. Tell us a bit about what Mr. Scheer just said today. He has faced a lot of questions for the past week since that video came out, and this is the first time that he was taking them from the media.
Not only have there been questions about his position and his current position on same-sex marriage, but also about what he would do if Prime Minister around the issue of abortion, because there's been some confusing stories over the past few days, what happened in Quebec, where some Conservative candidates believed, okay, no one can bring up this issue, caucus is not going to touch this issue, it's over. But no, the Conservative Party clarified, no, that's not actually the case at this point. So there was confusion on the issue of abortion. What does an Andrew Scheer government look like on the issue of abortion? And what does the Andrew Scheer government look like on the position of same-sex marriage? Because there were so many questions around this, for his entire news conference, just one question about an economic issue came up about the carbon tax. All the other questions were about social issues. Here's what he had to say about abortion.
That being said, we also recognize that we will not proceed with opening, we will oppose measures to open this. So I am confident that my party, my caucus, understands that. And as I said, as Prime Minister of Canada, I will always oppose measures that reopen these types of debates.
So the big question about what Andrew Scheer said today is it different from what he said to pro-life organizations, to anti-abortion organizations? And is it different from what his party has been saying in Quebec, where women's rights and this issue, there's strong support for abortion in that province? And so the Liberals today, they tweeted out a video of an interview with an anti-abortion activist from the group called Right Now, where he talks about how Andrew Scheer promised that Conservative cabinet ministers under his government, they could vote freely on something like this. And Andrew Scheer repeatedly talks about how he talks up the importance of being able to speak. I actually have a quote from it here. He says, "I can assure you that I support the right to individual MPs to speak out and bring and introduce matters that are important to them." So it still raises some questions about whether what he said in 2017 is that still a factor now, or is there some wiggle room in there between what he said then and now?
And correct me if I'm wrong, he didn't answer the question about whether he would whip a vote on something. He said that backbench MPs could bring forth, but that the government would not support them, but he didn't say whether or not
there was a lot
of
wiggle room in that.
And what about the Liberals? How are they responding to what's come about today?
Well, the Liberals have really been trying to play into this. What the Liberals are trying to do, in addition to tweeting that video today from Right Now, the anti-abortion group, of course, last Thursday, they did tweet that portion of Andrew Scheer's speech on same-sex marriage. By the way, Andrew Scheer was asked today if he regrets what he said, if he could understand that people now from the lens of today would see that as offensive. He didn't distance himself from the speech, but said a lot of people at that time were having a very heated discussion about that issue, but he didn't condemn what he said. He didn't distance himself from what he said. He said the party accepts the issue, it was voted on, and it is done. He said he will not reopen it there. But the Liberals are trying to motivate voters who are progressive and are thinking, maybe I'll vote Green, maybe I'll vote NDP. I'm not satisfied with the Liberal vote, but Justin Trudeau is trying to make the argument that he's the only candidate that can beat Andrew Scheer, so people should vote for him. Have a listen.
Leaders support people. Canada includes everyone, and leaders need to defend everyone, particularly people who've been marginalized. It's not enough to reluctantly support the law because it's a law, especially when it comes to the rights of women and LGBTQ communities.
He's going to keep trying to do that because as long as there are questions for Andrew Scheer on this, it knocks him off his main economic message. Andrew Scheer wants to be out on the doorsteps talking about jobs, talking about tax cuts and that kind of thing. Every day he has to answer questions about this. It's a day he's knocked off message.
All right. Thanks, Katie. The CBC's Katie Simpson. So how important are issues like these for Canadians on the eve of that federal election campaign? Shachi Kurl is the Executive Director of the Angus Reid Institute. She joins us from Vancouver. And Christian Bork is Executive Vice President at Leger. He joins us from Montreal. Hello to both of you. Great to see you.
Hi. Hello.
Shachi, let me start with you. So we have been talking for a few days now, about a week, around these social issues, specifically LGBT rights, homosexual marriage, as well as abortion. From your perspective, based on your research, how important are these issues to voters?
less important to voters, particularly uncommitted voters. These are not issues that are going to drive people who still haven't completely locked in their vote. At this stage, people have either decided whether they're tilting to the left of center or to the right of center on these types of issues, and they're either trying to make up their minds between those left of center parties, the Liberals, the NDP, the Greens, or they're going to vote Conservative. So campaigns do two things, and parties will do two things in a campaign, Vashi. There is trying to persuade those movable voters. These are not the issues that are going to persuade them, but they also need to excite their base. They need to motivate their base. And I think what you're seeing with the Conservatives is something of an acknowledgement that they are running out of room to grow their tent. So what do? If you know that this is the number of supporters you have to work with, you need to get them motivated, fired up to show up on election day or in the run-up in pre-voting. And that, I think, is a lot of what this messaging is about. On the other side of the spectrum, when you hear Justin Trudeau talking about the issue, he's trying to fire up and coalesce that left of center base behind him.
Yeah, Christiane, do you agree with that assessment, that this idea, especially that the Liberals are, targeting the Conservatives on these issues because, from my estimation at least, it's the idea that that block of voters that came out from them in 2015 who may not, extra voters that may not be so sure this time, it might say, not force them, but like encourage them to vote for the Liberals because they're afraid that the other guys will get in.
Exactly. So I believe this is talking directly to the Green Party supporter right now and to the NDP supporter at this moment. Because basically, if you are Mr. Trudeau, what you want is to get some of that Green support back under default, and the same for some of the NDP support that's left out there. And the way you do that is you say beyond sort of divisions within the left or on certain key political or social issues, there's an overarching issue here that we need to get rid of is, do you want to go back to the old guys, to the former guys? And I think you're trying to make this into a race between sort of forward-thinking progressive Canadians versus the other guys. And from that perspective, I think the win they're trying to race is to get some of these other left of center voters to reconsider the Liberals instead of maybe deciding on a third option.
Do you think it'll work, Shachi?
If they continue on social values issues, I think at some point they're going to run out of effectiveness. Again, on the right-hand side of the political spectrum, if Andrew Scheer wants to go there, his base is right there with him. However, for the left of center, when we look at uncommitted voters in this country, and most of them do tilt left, you ask, if you had to pick one issue, what is the one issue that you care most about in this campaign? It is not the protection of LGBTQ rights. It is not some of these same-sex marriage issues and social value issues. It doesn't mean they don't care about them, but they're not the motivating factor. What is at the top of that list? Climate change, access to health care, affordability, taxation, and ethics and honesty in government. So, obviously some of these things are going to dominate campaigns on certain days of certain weeks. But as we get down to the real essence of a campaign period, once that writ is dropped, I think, the Liberals are really going to have to emphasize their track record on things like carbon taxation to speak to those left of center voters and talk about how their promises on healthcare access and affordability are better than those of the NDPs or the Conservatives, because those are the top three issues that people who have not totally locked in yet are most concerned about.
Christiane, what about the Quebec case specifically? I remember speaking with a couple Liberal ministers a few weeks ago who were very keen on framing the election around a few issues, one of them being abortion, same-sex marriage, this kind of stuff. And this issue this week has been a live one in Quebec thanks to the reporting around Alain Reyes and what he said to candidates and whether or not, the Conservatives government will act one way and backbench MPs another. How does this issue play in Quebec? Might it work differently than in other parts of the country?
Well, one way it may be effective in Quebec is the fact that the pool of social conservatives in the province is very small. The pool of fiscal conservatives is a lot larger. So I believe what they're trying to do here is to try to send the message that We're here to reduce that level of support for the Conservatives to that smaller social conservative circle. If they're efficient at doing that, then the Liberals have won sort of the case. And from a Quebec perspective, you cannot play the Doug Ford card like you will play it in Ontario. So what's left? In terms, if you want to demonize the Conservatives, you need to fall back on traditional social issues like abortion, for example. And this whole thing started out with when they announced Madame Fréchette as a key sort of star candidate for the Conservatives, and it allowed them to actually play on sort of a division within the party and basically win the week, if you want, from that perspective.
Before we go, I want to get each of your perspectives on where the race stands right now. Shachi, your take on where things are at?
Well, new numbers from the Angus Reid Institute out this morning show a narrowing gap between the Conservatives and the Liberals. So two things are happening. Three things are happening. One, the Conservatives continue to show that they are pretty much stuck where they've been. They're not declining, but they're not really ascending. Two, the Liberals are continuing to claw back a little bit at a time, as they have been over the course of the summer, which says to me that the finding from Monsieur Dion, the ethics commissioner, in the last couple of weeks has not necessarily had the traction that many Liberals were worried it might. So a level of relief for the Liberals, disappointment for their opponents. And what we're also seeing is really an increase in the amount of daylight or the gap between the Liberals and the NDP and the Greens as they start to trend downwards. Now, those two other left of center parties aren't collapsing, but they are declining, and that is to the benefit of the Liberals. That's what we're seeing right now.
Christian, what are you seeing?
Yeah, we're sort of basically back to a neck-and-neck race, but however, that neck-and-neck race means something else for the Conservatives. Mainly when we're seeing so the Liberals climb back to where they were maybe a few months ago, is a decline in support for the Conservative Party in Ontario. So still the Conservatives will be very effective in delivering seats in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, in Manitoba, and in portions of BC as well, but they're losing some of that effectiveness in Ontario. And that's, again, the Doug Ford factor for a lot of pundits playing into this race. Now, if that battleground in Ontario is not as fertile as the Conservatives thought, maybe a couple of weeks or a couple of months back, they need to look at the other battlegrounds. And Battleground Quebec for them right now again indicates that the party that stands to gain the most seats in the province, given the weakness of NDP support right now, would be the Liberals and not the Conservatives. They're still in that sort of that mid-20s number for the Conservatives, which again would say that they would actually probably get the 10 seats they already have. But to be in seat gain territory, they would need to climb into the high 20s for that vote to become effective in delivering seats, and they're not there yet. So it's neck and neck with an advantage to the Liberals.
All right. Thank you very much. Both of you, appreciate your insight this evening. Thanks to Shachi Kurl of the Angus Reid Institute and Christian Bourque of Leger.
My pleasure.
Thanks, guys.
Individual MPs have the right to express themselves on matters of conscience, but that a Conservative government will not reopen these divisive social issues. The issue is settled. My personal views are that every single Canadian has the same equality rights under the law, and I will continue to uphold that. So I will always, as Prime Minister, stand up for equal access under law for all Canadians, including LGBT Canadians, defend their rights both here and abroad.
Every member of the Liberal Party of Canada will unequivocally support women's rights, and it's certainly not enough for the for the Conservative leader to try and reluctantly support laws or be unclear on this issue, particularly not since it seems like he's saying one thing in French in Quebec and something totally different in English in the rest of the country.
Conservative leader Andrew Scheer was asked to clarify his party's stance on some social issues today. He's been under pressure to do so since last week when the Liberal Party revived a 14-year-old video of Scheer speaking out against same-sex marriage in the House of Commons. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau doesn't appear to find Scheer's clarification sufficient, but will Canadian voters? Time for the Power Panel. In Calgary, former Director of Policy to Stephen Harper, Rachel Curran, now with Harper and Associates, Chief of Government Relations for University of Toronto and former Saskatchewan Finance Minister Andrew Thompson joins us from Toronto. And in Montreal, former Quebec Liberal Immigration and Environment Minister David Ertel. Hi to all three of you. Great to see you.
Hi, Vashi.
Hi, Vashi.
David, I'll start with you. Do you think what you heard from Mr. Scheer today is enough to put the issue to bed for the Conservatives?
No, it's not. It's definitely not. I know it's Thursday, but I think we can give this week to the Liberals already, because this story started with the a very positive announcement in Quebec for the Conservatives. Sylvie Fréchette, former gold medalist, star candidate, very eloquent. She gives an interview and now starts talking about abortion. Then the Quebec lieutenant for the Conservatives, Alain Reyes, adds on to this. 4 days now, the story has had legs. And really what's going on here for key ridings in Quebec, this is going to be an issue. I can let my colleagues talk about Ontario and the rest of the country. But this issue, this whole question of social values, social conservatism, this is something that, Quebec voters are allergic to, one. Two, also, this shows a lot of disorganization. We're not even at the starting blocks yet, and the Conservatives seem very disorganized. Look at the key messages we've been having. You're talking about Doug Ford, you're talking about Jason Kenney and Alberta separatism, and now you have this huge issue that monopolizes the week. This could force some voters that were looking maybe at other options in voting Liberal to go back to the Liberals to make sure they're blocking this type of agenda.
Andrew, do you think there is a difference between how this is playing out in Quebec and elsewhere?
Well, I think what David has said right at the end is the absolute key strategy that the Liberals are working on. They need to try to put together that coalition of progressives, especially young women who came out en masse in 2015 to support them and have now drifted away because of a number of broken promises on the part of the Liberals in terms of making life more affordable, providing better housing, making sure that there was electoral reform. There's a lot of these issues that younger voters in particular were motivated to come and support the Liberals on that are no longer, there's not much hope for. And so what the Liberals need to now try to do, in the absence of offering hope or having had a record to run on, they need to introduce this issue of fear. And this is particularly important in order to get those young voters back away from the NDP, where they're parking now, and the Greens, back into that Liberal tent. So I'm not sure, as this tracks across the campaign, whether this is going to be sufficient really to mobilize those voters enough to come back out in favor of the Liberals.
Do you think it'll work, Rachel?
Yeah, absolutely. If I were the Liberals, I'd be talking about these issues every single day of the campaign. I absolutely think they will work across the country. And I do think it's a failure of issues management on the part of the Conservatives. I mean, look, less than 2 weeks ago, maybe a week ago, we had this bombshell report from the Ethics Commissioner saying that Justin Trudeau had broken the law and outlining in pretty devastating detail, the sort of failures within his office. And, the coverage of that lasted a day or two, and then we moved on to abortion and same-sex marriage, and that has been the story for the last few days. So these absolutely are issues that resonate, and I suspect the Liberals are going to be talking about them through the entire campaign.
What, if you were advising him, what would you have heard from Mr. Scheer today that would have put it to bed? Do you think there is something he could have said to stymie this?
Yeah, I mean, look, on the issue of same-sex marriage, I think what would have helped would have been to hear him say that his own personal views had evolved since 2005, much as Jason Kenney did during the Alberta provincial campaign. He didn't say that. Now look, he's clearly not going to do anything about the law. He's not going to make any changes to the law. But his personal views remain that same-sex marriage is somehow illegitimate. So, voters are going to be weighing that against Justin Trudeau's record of incompetence and corruption and trying to figure out, sort of who's worse.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you point that out. I'm wondering what you think, David. In the press conference, I thought that Mr. Scheer was pretty unequivocal about the idea that the government itself wouldn't do anything. But on questions, as Rachel points out, of how his personal beliefs have evolved, the type of things he said in that video in 2005, he wasn't clear. He was asked many times, when did they evolve? How did they evolve? In what way have they evolved? And he did talk about equality for all Canadians and dignity for all Canadians, but he didn't really address the nature of the question. Do you think that, I guess, what do you think of that?
Well, I felt that he was not very comfortable during the entire press conference. I didn't see emotion. I didn't see a personal connection or him trying to connect with the issue and the concerns these issues are raising right now with a lot of Canadians. And I thought he was just plain uncomfortable. And he, in terms of content, I mean, it was okay, but the appearance he gave, it just didn't connect well. And the other piece is, why wait 4 days? That's another thing. Why didn't he come out on Tuesday very clearly on this, or Wednesday even? And the other thing is doing this in English. Now, I understand he did it in French, but I mean, there had to be a much stronger, more heartfelt message in Quebec. We haven't seen Andrew Scheer much in Quebec this summer. And he hasn't been very present, and we haven't seen the Conservatives. And while I understand, and we've been saying this for months now, that Ontario is probably going to be the key battlegrounds, but Quebec can be important very, very much also. And if he doesn't make his presence felt in Quebec, we don't hear him, we don't see him, and make that type of emotional connections to these types of issues with women, with younger voters, as Andrew said, well, then a lot of people will go back to the Liberals. And in key races where there's going to be three-way or even four-way races, that could give enough to the Liberals to squeak by.
To what degree, Andrew, do you think this issue sticks around during the campaign? Do you think there is effectively, we had a pollster on earlier Shachi Kurl talking about how there might be sort of a runway for this kind of stuff, but that it also, like you all have been saying, can be effective as well?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit limited in terms of how long this can play, unless there's something really new. Talking about what people were doing back in the late 90s or the 2003, 2004, 2005 period, isn't particularly current. And if you really are trying to motivate young voters to come over and come back into that kind of Liberal tent, I think the Liberals are going to have to come up with something more compelling. Now, I would say that the strategy that the NDP and the Greens are going to have to really be thinking about is how to block that, how to make sure that they are front and center in terms of standing up for the rights of women and other marginalized groups. And I think that's why you saw last week the NDP under Singh come forward so forcefully to say that there was no way whatsoever that they would support any kind of a government that was led by Andrew Scheer.
Do you think that message worked, though? Because I think a lot of people sort of took from that they were saying, oh, we're not going to win the election.
Well, I do think that it was working with the voters that they were positioning it to. And that's really what we're talking about here, is a very kind of targeted approach. It's a curious situation in the country right now that we have that none of the political leaders are particularly popular. And I think that is the other issue here. So it's a case of how do these leaders who are unpopular, the Prime Minister is particularly polarizing as a figure and has a lot of negatives against him, how does he start to build back a coalition that keeps him in office? Singh has a similar problem in terms of not being known and not being particularly well liked. Andrew Scheer probably has the opposite problem, that people kind of know him and don't really like what they're seeing. So this is a really messy situation for these leaders to be trying to figure out how to get a positive coalition put back together.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.